pristine, hyper-modern blueprint rotates on the monitor. Glowing lines snap into perfect equilateral triangles, highlighting flawless spatial alignments and absolute mathematical symmetry. You are looking at a millimeter-accurate point cloud scan. But this is not a render from a contemporary architecture firm in Silicon Valley. The digital grid overlays rough, weathered limestone pillars carved 12,000 years ago. The primitive cavemen you were taught to mock understood advanced spatial geometry. Your high school history textbooks lied to you. They sold you a comforting, linear escalator of human progress, a slow crawl from grunting stupidity to modern intelligence. If you still believe that official narrative, you are fundamentally underestimating your own species. Clinging to that outdated timeline keeps you blind to how massive cognitive leaps actually happen. It leaves you intellectually vulnerable in our current era of rapid, terrifying, technological disruption. We are going to tear up that standard timeline and throw it in the fire. By applying the aggressive lens of modern spatial analysis to these ancient stones, I will give you mathematical proof that defies logic. The human mind did not slowly evolve the capacity to understand abstract science over millennia. It exploded into visionary genius almost overnight. It was this sudden, violent burst of geometric obsession that literally forced the invention of civilization itself. Twilight settles over the dusty trenches of Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. The air tastes of dry earth and ancient ash. A high-frequency laser scanner sweeps over the massive T-shaped megaliths, casting a sharp, neon-green grid across the shadows. On a glowing field monitor, the digital twin of the excavation site materializes in real time. We are witnessing the ultimate paradox. The raw, brutal dirt of the deep past, colliding directly with the cold, unforgiving math of the present. Look closely at the scan data rendering on the screen. The sheer physical scale of this anomaly immediately shatters the established anthropological models. Rising from the bedrock are colossal central limestone pillars dominating the subterranean enclosures. These are not rough, unhewn boulders stacked by chance. Each of these primary monoliths weighs up to 16 tons. They were extracted from the earth with absolute intent, shaped with an obsessive symmetry that defies their crude tools. The anomaly expands the further we push the radar. The main excavated area alone stretches out, creating a massive, organized footprint, roughly 330 feet wide. This is not a temporary campsite or a casual gathering spot for nomadic hunters. This is a deliberate, highly engineered arena. You are looking at the foundational architecture of an entire society, carved into the bedrock with a terrifying level of ambition that hunter-gatherers were never supposed to possess. Every single piece of this colossal puzzle was quarried from the surrounding limestone plateaus. The builders then transported these monolithic blocks across jagged, unforgiving terrain and meticulously carved them. And they executed this staggering feat of civil engineering exactly 12,000 years ago. That number alone should induce intellectual vertigo. We are talking about an epoch when the last ice age was still releasing its icy grip on the northern hemisphere. To understand the true gravity of that date, we must recalibrate our sense of deep time. This architectural masterpiece predates the initial assembly of Stonehenge by over 7,000 years. It predates the Great Pyramids of Giza by an equally absurd margin. The existence of this site completely obliterates the established timeline of human history. It takes the textbook theory that agriculture allowed for the leisure time to build monuments and systematically breaks it over its knee. The academic establishment categorized these people as primitive foragers. They were supposed to be shivering in caves, entirely consumed by the daily, brutal, caloric math of basic survival. They had no agriculture, no writing systems, no metal tools, and no established social hierarchy. Yet, the immutable data captured by our laser scanners tells a wildly different story. It reveals a highly sophisticated workforce, executing a master plan that required an astonishing level of coordination. The math simply does not align with the historical narrative. A project of this magnitude demands hundreds, perhaps thousands of dedicated laborers working in perfect synchronization over decades. It requires specialized engineers, master stonemasons, and a central authority capable of directing an army of workers. But according to every accepted anthropological rule, an organized labor force of that size could not possibly exist before the domestication of plants and animals. We must confront the stark reality of their technological limitations. These builders possessed no domesticated beasts of burden to drag the immense weight of the limestone. They had no wheeled carts to reduce the crushing friction against the earth. They possessed only stone blades, flint axes, and raw human muscle. Yet they somehow mobilized a scattered, fragmented population of nomads into a hyper-focused, synchronized machine capable of moving mountains, one massive block at a time. As the glowing green lines of the digital topography map trace the edges of the enclosures, the glaring impossibility of the site screams from the data. This is an architectural crime scene that violates the fundamental laws of societal evolution. The evidence is solid rock, weighing thousands of tons, laughing at the established models of human progress. The builders left us a physical paradox that demands a complete rewrite of our species' cognitive awakening. You cannot unsee the contradiction carved into this Turkish hillside. The sheer kinetic energy required to shear, shape, and erect these pillars is astronomical. Every ton of stone moved represents thousands of calories burned by an invisible workforce that had no reliable food supply. The deeper we scan, the more the traditional story of our origins collapses under the immense, crushing gravity of these perfect geometric circles. We are staring at a biological and historical impossibility. This brings us to the ultimate cognitive roadblock, an enigma I call the impossible weight paradox. We're looking at an undeniable masterclass in logistics, executed by ghosts who theoretically lacked the capacity for complex societal organization. If humanity was truly just a scattered collection of terrified scavengers hiding from the elements, how did they pull this off? The raw physics of the excavation site force us to ask a question that terrifies traditional historians. How do scattered, disorganized bands of hunter-gatherers suddenly unite to lift 16-ton megaliths out of the bedrock without the invention of wheels, pulleys, or beasts of burden? What singular, overwhelming obsession possessed these primitive nomads to suddenly stop running, stand their ground, and engineer a permanent monument to a mathematics they were never supposed to understand? The answer is buried deeper in the radar data, and it is going to change everything you know about yourself. The answer to that terrifying question is not found by staring at the single illuminated T-pillar we just analyzed. To find the truth, you have to look down. Through the eyes of the field geophysicist, dragging a heavy sled under a blazing 100-degree Fahrenheit sun, the Urfa Plateau feels like a barren wasteland. But beneath the cracked dirt, the scanner screen is pulsing with a structural echo that shatters the official narrative of human history. We are conditioned by high school textbooks to view these ancient builders as primitive survivors, barely clinging to existence in scattered groups. You were taught that civilization was a slow, agonizing crawl out of the mud. Yet, as the ground-penetrating radar sweeps across this desolate hill, the telemetry data paints an entirely different, highly organized reality. The sweat stinging the researcher's eyes is forgotten the moment the subterranean map fully renders. What you are looking at is the tip of an architectural iceberg, a deliberate deception played by time itself. The 4 excavated circles of Gobekli Tepe, the ones that already broke the timeline by predating Stonehenge, are just the lobby of a hidden megacity. The radar waves bouncing back from the deep limestone bedrock reveal a shocking subterranean topography. The Earth is actively hiding an empire of stone, entirely untouched by human hands for 12 millennia. The electromagnetic pulses plunging into the soil reflect a mathematically precise grid of anomalies. Ground-penetrating radar reveals at least 15 more circular enclosures sleeping completely untouched beneath the Earth. These are not random clusters of rocks or natural geological formations. They are perfect acoustic signatures of massive engineered rings, repeating a strict geometric pattern that stretches far beyond the boundaries of the current excavation trenches. The anomaly deepens when we analyze the depth and density of the radar returns. The data indicates some of the buried pillars reach nearly 20 feet in height, dwarfing the massive 16-ton megaliths currently visible on the surface. To a structural engineer, a 20-foot monolithic support implies an exponentially larger spanning roof, or a central hub of staggering proportions. We are dealing with an escalating scale of ambition that defies primitive hunter-gatherer logistics. Let that sink into your modern, technologically dependent brain. You were told that complex, multi-generational engineering was the exclusive domain of settled agricultural societies. You were programmed to believe that true architecture required the surplus calories of grain silos and the brutal hierarchy of a king. But the radar screen glowing in the blistering Turkish heat proves that your foundational understanding of societal progression is entirely backward. The full composite scan maps a contiguous master-planned grid that spreads relentlessly beneath the plateau. The entire complex covers 22 acres, representing an impossible scale of coordinated labor for supposedly disjointed nomadic tribes. 22 acres is the size of 17 American football fields, densely packed with highly specialized masonry. This is not a seasonal campsite. This is the relentless execution of a sprawling, permanent civic center. Think about the sheer biological mathematics required to sustain this operation. Moving a single stone that massive requires hundreds of focused, well-fed adults pulling in perfect unison. Now, multiply that effort across 22 acres of relentless construction, spanning multiple generations. They had to organize supply lines, manage tool production, and somehow command an army of laborers without a written language. This demands a level of cognitive software we assumed they lacked. We are witnessing a cognitive supernova. The architectural ambition locked in this radar data demonstrates a species suddenly gripping the concept of infinity and forcing it into physical reality. The geophysicist staring at the monitor knows they are not looking at the desperate work of survivors. They are looking at the audacious blueprint of visionaries who decided to bend the raw, unforgiving elements of the Ice Age into a permanent geometric monument. But the most paralyzing realization is the sheer volume of history still trapped in the dark. Despite decades of painstaking removal of dirt and rubble, we've currently excavated less than 5% of the total structure. 95% of this visionary complex remains entombed, guarding its secrets in the pitch black. The handful of majestic pillars standing under the modern protective canopy are a mere footnote to a vast, invisible encyclopedia of ancient science. If a mere 5% of this site was enough to completely shatter the global timeline of architectural history, what world-breaking revelations are sleeping in the remaining 95%? Every unexcavated radar hit is a ticking time bomb for the established academic consensus. We are standing on top of a buried hard drive of human origins, and we have barely managed to read the first few lines of its unimaginably dense, ancient code. Your textbooks lied to you by omission, offering a comfortable, linear story because the alternative was too complex to explain. They categorized our ancestors as simple scavengers because acknowledging their sheer, unadulterated genius forces us to ask terrifying questions. Why did they build this sprawling 22-acre machine? What invisible force compelled thousands of scattered humans to unite and carve a geometric masterpiece out of the unforgiving bedrock? They were not merely stacking rocks to appease primitive gods. They were encoding a highly specific mathematical language into the landscape itself. As we transition from the raw, overwhelming quantity of the buried pillars to the precise spatial relationships between them, the chaos of the nomadic world vanishes entirely. What emerges from the dust is a chilling level of calculated perfection, proving that this entire subterranean empire was built to a single mathematical blueprint. The transition from the sheer, overwhelming quantity of pillars to the incredibly tight spatial relationship between them is where the official narrative completely collapses. You were taught that primitive humans built organic, sprawling settlements, adding huts randomly as their tribes expanded. I am here to tell you that the mathematics buried at this site brutally reject that comfortable fairy tale. Step out of the blazing Turkish sun and into the freezing air conditioning of a modern, multi-monitor research lab. Here, an archaeoastronomer stares at a pristine, three-dimensional digital twin of the excavation site, glowing in the dark. The point cloud data rotates on the screen, mapping every groove and fracture of the ancient limestone. The researcher is not looking for primitive art. They are hunting for the underlying mathematical code of the builders. What emerges from the glowing data points is an intellectual nightmare for traditional historians. The layout of these massive stone rings is not a series of accidental additions layered over centuries of wandering nomads. It is the exact opposite. The archaeoastronomer realizes they are staring at the execution of a single, pre-calculated blueprint. The builders were not stacking stones blindly. They were locking a permanent mathematical grid into the earth. If you look closely at the central points of the three oldest excavated circular structures, designated as enclosures B, C, and D, a terrifying symmetry begins to materialize. For decades, archaeologists treated these rings as separate, isolated temples built sequentially. But the raw data from the high-resolution topographic scan tells a vastly different story. The researcher clicks a command, and the software strips away the dirt and the chaotic noise of history. A bright, red, invisible geometric line snaps instantly into place on the monitor, connecting the exact center points of those three enclosures. According to algorithm-driven spatial analysis published in the year 2020, these three massive rings form a perfect equilateral triangle. Let that sink in. A flawless, three-sided geometric shape, locked into the bedrock by people who supposedly lacked the capacity for complex, abstract thought. This is Euclidean geometry existing in the physical world roughly 9,000 years before the Greek mathematician Euclid was even born. The archaeoastronomer sitting in that dark lab feels a profound sense of frustrated awe. It is deeply irritating to modern arrogance to realize that a perfect geometric algorithm was flawlessly executed by a workforce wearing animal skins. They possessed a functional understanding of spatial mathematics that we previously thought was impossible. You might think this triangle is just a rough approximation, a lucky coincidence achieved by primitive guesswork. But the algorithms do not lie, and they do not round up to protect our fragile scientific egos. Across hundreds of feet of jagged, uneven, and incredibly rough terrain, the maximum deviation from a mathematically perfect geometric ideal is less than 1.5%. That represents a margin of error bordering on absolute zero. To maintain a deviation of less than 1.5% across an active construction site of that magnitude requires relentless, obsessive surveying. You cannot achieve this level of precision by simply standing on a hill and pointing. The builders had to constantly measure, calculate, and adjust massive 16-ton megaliths to ensure the central focal points remained completely anchored to their invisible geometric grid. The researcher traces the glowing red lines on the screen, understanding the brutal logistics required to force this math into the dirt. This is not the behavior of a hunter-gatherer tribe just trying to survive the next winter. This is the behavior of a highly organized society prioritizing abstract scientific perfection above all else. They were writing a permanent message in the universal language of geometry, knowing it would outlast their own flesh. The existence of this perfect equilateral triangle shatters the idea of random, generational building. This level of extreme physical precision requires a single, conceptual architectural floor plan to have been mathematically conceived before a single stone was ever placed. They did not invent the layout as they went along. The entire spatial relationship of the complex was completely resolved in their brilliant minds before they ever broke ground. This proves a massive, unprecedented leap in human cognition. It means the software of our minds, our capacity for visionary planning, high-level abstraction, and rigorous spatial analysis was already fully compiled 12,000 years ago. The builders were not reacting to their harsh environment. They were actively conquering it through pure intellect. They visualized an impossibly complex design, and then they coordinated an army to physically manifest it. It is time to discard everything you thought you knew about the primitive mind. The people who plotted those three enclosures were not cavemen acting on raw survival instinct. They were the very first architects, engineers, and scientists. They saw the invisible lines of geometry that govern the universe and decided to drag those lines down from the heavens and hammer them violently into the very foundation of the earth. But a perfect equilateral triangle pointing randomly into the dirt serves no true functional purpose. The archaeoastronomer zooms out on the digital model, knowing that mathematics of this caliber is always oriented toward a greater, overarching system. If the builders went to such agonizing lengths to lock these structures into an exact spatial grid, the central axis of that triangle was not pointing at the ground. It was pointing directly up. Follow that central axis straight up into the black. We are conditioned to view ancient ruins as dead stone, but you are looking at dormant hardware. The official narrative wants you to believe these were primitive shelters or crude, meaningless altars. You were completely wrong. When the digital planetarium projection overlays the physical pillars of Gobekli Tepe, the true nature of this geometric grid is finally unlocked. It is a highly sophisticated machine. We are used to thinking of telescopes as delicate cylinders of glass and polished mirrors, invented by men in powdered wigs during the Renaissance. But 12 millennia ago, visionary architects built a functioning observatory using thousands of tons of carved limestone. The anomaly here is staggering. These nomadic hunters did not just look at the stars, they locked them into a mathematical cage. They built a sky machine without a single lens, designed to track the cosmos. But to prove this, you cannot just look up at tonight's sky. The universe is not static. It is a violently rotating vault. The Earth operates with a gravitational wobble, a slow, majestic shifting of its axis known as precession. Because the planet spins like a dying top, the apparent position of the stars shifts drastically over the millennia. What you see above you tonight is a complete optical illusion compared to the pristine sky that existed during the Ice Age. I rewind the digital clock on the simulation. The simulated night sky above the stone pillars begins to blur, spinning backward through history. Centuries fall away in seconds. Due to axial precession, the constellations slide wildly out of their familiar modern positions. To understand the builders, you have to rip away 12,000 years of celestial drift and reconstruct the exact stellar canopy that hung over the cold, barren expanse of the Urfa Plateau. The simulation locks into place. The software stops exactly at the year 9100 BC. The sky stops shifting. At this precise mathematical moment, the heavens align, and the true target of this massive stone crosshair is finally revealed. They were not tracking the sun, and they were not tracking the moon. The architects were hunting a cosmic newborn, a brilliant stellar entity that had never before been seen from this specific latitude on the planet. In the year 9100 BC, the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius, pierced the horizon and became visible in this region for the very first time. It did not gradually drift into view. It practically detonated across the southern skyline, a blinding blue-white diamond burning through the atmospheric haze. For a species that navigated by the stars, the sudden birth of a superluminary object must have felt like a direct transmission from the gods. You have to understand the psychological shock of this event. Your ancestors did not just shrug and go back to hunting deer. They recognized an absolute paradigm shift in the firmament. The sudden appearance of Sirius was so mathematically profound that they mobilized an entire society to permanently capture its exact azimuth. They decided to nail the sky to the earth, anchoring this celestial anomaly in solid bedrock so its precise coordinates could never be lost. The digital model proves the impossible. The massive central pillars of the oldest, deepest enclosures were engineered to act as a precise, permanent crosshair. They form a brutalist gun sight, perfectly targeting the exact geometric point where Sirius would rise above the rocky horizon. The two megaliths stand parallel, creating a narrow, perfectly calibrated viewing corridor that isolates the birth of this specific star from the chaotic noise of the rest of the galaxy. Your high school textbooks sold you a comfortable, sanitized lie. They taught you that the rigorous measurement of the stars began with the Babylonians or the Greeks thousands of years later. They told you ancient hunter-gatherers lacked the cognitive bandwidth for abstract astronomy. But the cold, hard geometry of Gobekli Tepe violently exposes that ignorance. You are looking at an incredibly sophisticated astronomical database, hard-coded into the landscape by prehistoric geniuses. Think about the staggering arrogance and vision required to attempt this. They did not have written language, they did not have metal, but they perfectly understood the cyclical mechanics of the universe. They calculated the exact trajectory of a newly born star and aligned 16-ton blocks of limestone to greet it. They constructed a physical interface between humanity and the cosmos, forcing the Earth to mirror the heavens above it. The macrocosm was downloaded into the microcosm. To achieve this level of precise alignment, the architects had to observe the sky for generations. You cannot calculate the rising azimuth of a star in a single night. It requires decades of continuous, unbroken data collection passed down through an oral tradition of immense rigorousness. The ancient elders must have tracked the subtle, infinitesimal shifts of the horizon, plotting the complex math in their minds before translating that cosmic data into a physical blueprint. As the digital Sirius blazes perfectly between the virtual pillars on the monitor, the sheer weight of their mathematical achievement becomes impossible to ignore. These ancient people were fundamentally no different from the astrophysicists working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory today. They possessed the same raw processing power, the same desperate need to decode the universe. They just used a different medium to record their findings. They used the bones of the Earth. The geometry of Gobekli Tepe is a flawless cosmic mirror. But as the simulation continues to run, the data reveals something much darker hiding within the math. The builders were not just celebrating the beautiful birth of Sirius. They were obsessively watching the sky for a very different reason. Because the stars do not just bring light. Sometimes they bring absolute, extinction-level destruction. And the builders carved that impending nightmare into the stone, too. We are conditioned to view ancient carvings as naive mythology, a primitive attempt to explain the rain or the seasons. But your textbook assumptions fail entirely when you stand before the sheer terror etched into the vulture stone. This monolith, known in the official archives as Pillar 43, is not a gallery of primitive hunting trophies. It is a desperately urgent, mathematically precise recording of a global nightmare. Through the eyes of the archaeoastronomer, standing in the glowing dark of the modeling lab, the high-contrast animation of the stone completely shatters the official narrative. As the digital light washes over the weathered limestone, the carved animals detach from the rock. They begin to float, transforming into a glowing web of constellations right before our eyes. You have been looking at a literal star chart, disguised as a zoo. You probably thought the zodiac was a Greek invention, a neat little astrological parlor trick engineered a few millennia ago. That is the comforting fiction of modern arrogance. The archaeoastronomer sees a far more terrifying truth embedded in the geometry of the vulture stone. These figures, the scorpion, the wolf, the bird with the sphere, are exact, coordinate-mapped representations of the night sky, predating the Greeks by 8,000 years. This brings us to the ultimate paradox of Gobekli Tepe, the Rosetta Stone of the Apocalypse. If you possess the cognitive bandwidth to map the cosmos with pinpoint accuracy, why are you obsessed with one highly specific, deeply unsettling alignment? They were not passively watching the beautiful drift of the stars. They were recording a specific temporal coordinate, a timestamp of an event so catastrophic it nearly erased them from the Earth. When the archaeoastronomer feeds the spatial data of the vulture stone into the mainframe, the algorithmic results are absolutely undeniable. The statistical analysis of the animal reliefs does not match a random prehistoric hunting pattern. Instead, it perfectly matches the exact, verifiable layout of the zodiac constellations as they appeared in the sky in the year 10,950 BC. Let that date sink in for a moment. 10,950 BC. This is not an estimate. And it is not a mythological metaphor. It is a hard, mathematical timestamp locked into the limestone matrix. The archaeoastronomer realizes that the builders used the slow, predictable wobble of the Earth's axis as a giant cosmic clock to freeze a specific moment in history. They wanted to make absolutely certain we knew exactly when the sky fell. Why fixate on that exact year? Because the geologic record from ice cores perfectly aligns with the astronomical data carved into Pillar 43. In the simulation, we wind the digital clock back to that precise moment. A violent streak of light tears across the planetarium projection. A simulated comet strikes the digital Earth, and the comfortable illusion of our stable, predictable history instantly vaporizes into the cold void. This highly specific date corresponds flawlessly with the younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The official narrative tries to ignore the sudden, violent trauma in our planetary timeline, but the data is completely unambiguous. A swarm of comet fragments slammed into the northern hemisphere, triggering a cataclysmic environmental collapse. The archaeoastronomer watches the simulated ash cloud suffocate the globe, blocking out the very stars they worshipped. The resulting global winter was not a gradual climate shift. It was a sudden, brutal execution. Global temperatures plummeted by an astonishing 18 degrees Fahrenheit in mere decades. Glaciers surged forward, ecosystems collapsed overnight, and the human population was violently bottlenecked. The people who built Gobekli Tepe were the traumatized survivors of an apocalypse, crawling out of the ash to rebuild a broken world. The vulture stone is not primitive art. The archaeoastronomer understands it is a highly secure, permanent astronomical warning carved in stone to ensure the data survived the end of the world. They witnessed the sky rain fire, watched their environment freeze over, and realized that human memory is far too fragile. They needed a data storage device that could survive fire, ice, and time itself. They chose bedrock. You have to recognize the sheer, indomitable genius of our ancestors. Instead of surrendering to the absolute terror of a collapsing biosphere, they turned to mathematics. They quantified their trauma. They mapped the trajectory of their near extinction so that whoever came after them, so that you and I, would know exactly what the universe is capable of. They hard-coded their survival into the geometric foundation of the Earth. The official academic establishment wants to keep you comfortable, painting a picture of slow, peaceful progress from the cave to the smartphone. But the cold data pulsing on the screens of the modeling lab tells a story of survival, of a species that was nearly wiped out and responded by inventing monumental architecture to warn the future. This is the intellectual inheritance that has been hidden from you for 12 millennia. If this staggering realization that prehistoric hunter-gatherers engineered a mathematical warning about a global apocalypse shatters your view of human potential, hit the like button right now. To ensure you do not miss the next phase of this massive historical cover-up, subscribe to the channel. And I want you to tell me in the comments, do you think modern humanity would have the cognitive discipline to leave a warning this permanent? The revelation of the vulture stone fundamentally rewrites the psychological profile of the builders. They were not driven by simple biological imperatives. They were driven by an all-consuming, existential trauma. The need to preserve this specific cosmic data required an army of specialized laborers, stonecutters, and astronomers working in perfect synchronization for generations. It was a massive, desperate mobilization of human capital. But this monumental effort immediately creates an entirely new, deeply uncomfortable paradox that defies all conventional logic. As the digital simulation fades and the brutal reality of the Ice Age sets in, a purely logistical nightmare emerges. You have thousands of traumatized people gathering to carve a cosmic warning into 16-ton pillars. In a frozen, dying world, how do you feed an army of geniuses who refuse to stop building? You were taught a comfortable, linear myth about the dawn of civilization. The story goes that a nomadic tribe stumbled upon a fertile valley, accidentally dropped some seeds, and decided to settle down. But as we stand in the blistering heat of the Urfa Plateau, watching the digital reconstruction of tens of thousands of laborers hauling limestone, that high school textbook narrative completely disintegrates. The brutal reality of survival demands a totally different explanation. We are looking at the ultimate biological paradox. We are deep in the hostile, freezing aftermath of the Younger Dryas climate shock. The environment is actively trying to kill everything. Yet here is an army of specialized stonecutters operating in perfect synchrony. To understand how they survived, you have to look past the cosmic geometry and focus on the sheer, terrifying logistics of the operation. Gathering wild berries does not fuel an empire of stone. Calculate the sheer caloric math required to build this massive complex. Dragging just one of those 16-ton pillars across the uneven earth burns thousands of calories per hour per worker. Now multiply that localized physical agony by the 22 sprawling acres of subterranean megastructures we mapped out earlier. A standard hunter-gatherer band spends its entire daily existence desperately chasing enough protein just to survive the night. They simply do not have the metabolic surplus to stand in one place and carve complex astronomical warnings into bedrock. Nomads are forced to move with the herds and the seasons. Yet this massive workforce remained entirely stationary for decades, perhaps centuries. This is a glaring, impossible anomaly. How do you anchor a massive population of hyper-intelligent builders in a single location when the entire ecosystem is collapsing around them? The answer lies hidden in the topography just 20 miles away from these buried stones. Looming over the horizon is the Karacha Dagh mountain, an ancient volcanic peak rising from the dusty plains. For decades, archaeologists treated this mountain merely as a backdrop to the site. But modern genomic sequencing has completely shattered that assumption, revealing a profound biological conspiracy that rewrites the very foundation of our modern world. This is not a speculative archaeological theory. This is cold, hard, mathematical certainty. Top geneticists recently analyzed the DNA of our entire global food supply. By tracing the genetic lineage backward through time, they pinpointed the exact, undisputed origin point of all modern domesticated einkorn wheat. The source code for the agricultural revolution points directly to the harsh slopes of the Karacha Dagh mountain. Our ancestors did not just stumble upon a better patch of wild grass. They recognized an absolute necessity and violently hacked the biology of the plant. The strict requirement of feeding thousands of massive laborers continuously, day after day, forced these visionary architects to engineer a completely new mutant strain of crops. They became the first genetic engineers on the planet, out of sheer, unadulterated desperation to keep the project alive. The counterintuitive brilliance of this operation is staggering. In the wild, einkorn wheat shatters the moment it ripens, scattering its seeds to the wind and making it completely impossible to harvest in massive industrial quantities. To feed an army of masons, these supposed primitives deliberately selectively bred a specific genetic glitch.
They isolated and amplified a mutation that forced the grain to remain firmly attached to the stalk.
Suddenly, the colossal fire-scorched pits excavated around the perimeter of the central enclosures make terrifying perfect sense. These were not the remnants of a successful tribal hunt or a casual primitive gathering. They were the engines of an industrial-scale bakery, operating day and night. They processed tons of genetically modified grain to provide a continuous stream of fuel for a workforce completely consumed by an architectural obsession. This data completely obliterates the official narrative of human progress. You were programmed to believe that agriculture was a prerequisite for complex thought. The old model insists that humanity learned to farm, built up a surplus of food, created a specialized workforce, and finally, with all that extra free time, decided to build a temple. But the raw evidence carved into these ancient stones proves the exact opposite is true. The human desire to build a massive cosmic observatory directly triggered the agricultural revolution. They did not build these geometric masterpieces because they had a stable food supply. They forcefully invented a stable food supply because they were absolutely obsessed with building these massive monuments. The intellectual vision of the cosmos came first. The genetic manipulation of our daily bread came second. I want you to truly process the magnitude of this paradigm shift. The foundational technology that sustains 8 billion humans on this planet today, the very concept of agriculture, was not born from a desire for comfort. It was a secondary byproduct of a desperate, visionary urge to map the stars and record the trauma of a cataclysm. We are not a species of passive biological survivors. We are a species of obsessed cosmic engineers. We will literally rewrite the foundational genetic code of the entire biosphere, just to ensure that our warnings to the future survive the test of time. The agricultural revolution was merely a logistical tool, a brutal hack designed to keep the megalith builders swinging their hammers. This completely redefines the hierarchy of human needs, proving that abstract mathematical thought is our primary evolutionary driver. The sheer audacity of these ancient minds is mesmerizing. They engineered mutant crops, solved the ultimate logistical paradox of the Ice Age, and successfully mobilized a massive society. They fed an army of geniuses, carved the heavens into the bedrock, and established a permanent foothold on a hostile planet. They had conquered their environment and achieved the absolute pinnacle of early human organization. Yet right at the apex of this staggering intellectual and biological victory, the entire operation grinds to a sudden, inexplicable halt. The great cosmic machine was fully operational, fueled by fields of modified wheat, and yet they made a decision that defies all logical explanation. They did not celebrate their triumph. They prepared for a burial. And what they did next is the most unsettling mystery of the ancient world. You are taught that a thriving civilization builds higher, expanding its dominion until it collapses under its own weight. That is a comforting lie, a modern misconception born from our own obsession with perpetual growth. The builders of this cosmic observatory achieved absolute mastery over their environment. They commanded the first fields of mutant wheat, fueled an army of specialized engineers, and mapped the heavens. And then, at the zenith of their power, they committed architectural suicide. Through the relentless 100-degree Fahrenheit heat of the Urfa Plateau, the field geophysicist drags the heavy ground-penetrating radar sled over the baked earth. The monitor does not show a slow, tragic decay caused by the passage of time. It reveals a highly deliberate, traumatic termination of the site.
They did not slowly abandon their masterpiece to the elements. They killed it. Why would a society expend massive amounts of energy to erase its own greatest achievement?
The data scrolling across the radar screen is absolute, defying every textbook you have ever read. Around 8000 BC, this civilization made a sudden, collective pivot. They stopped observing the stars and started digging the earth. They intentionally backfilled the entire 22-acre complex. We are not talking about a thin layer of protective dust. They hauled thousands of tons of limestone rubble, shattered animal bones, and dense soil up this colossal hill. This was an anti-construction project of terrifying proportions.
To bury a 22-acre megalithic grid requires a logistical supply chain just as complex as the one required to build it. They had to mobilize a massive workforce, not to carve the stone, but to swallow it in absolute darkness. The radar pulses indicate a chaotic, yet thoroughly calculated matrix of debris. They packed the dirt tight, filling every geometric void, smothering the limestone giants they had spent generations perfecting.
Your high school history teacher would call this a ritual sacrifice, a primitive offering to the gods of the underworld. That is the lazy answer, the academic equivalent of throwing up your hands in defeat. Look at the radar telemetry. Look at the sheer mathematical precision of the rubble distribution. This is not a chaotic religious frenzy. This is a cold, calculated sealing protocol. They were putting the system into a deep, cryogenic sleep. The stratigraphy of the soil profiles proves this was not a natural burial by wind, erosion, or time. Nature buries things in uneven, predictable layers, leaving a gradual geologic signature. The cross-sections here scream of human intervention. It was a highly organized, ritualistic entombment that took nearly as much effort as building the site. They were systematically shutting down a massive machine, pulling the plug on a 12,000-year-old mainframe. The geophysicist stops the sled, wiping sweat from their eyes, staring at the subterranean ghost city glowing on the monitor. The heat is suffocating, but the realization is freezing. The builders were not hiding their work from enemies. If you want to destroy a monument, you knock it down. You smash the pillars. You burn the scaffolding. You do not carefully encase it in a protective shell of engineered debris. You only do that if you intend for it to survive. This is where your understanding of ancient humanity must undergo a violent upgrade. They understood the destructive mechanics of the atmosphere better than most modern structural engineers. Leaving these beautifully carved limestone pillars exposed to the biting frost and the scouring winds of the global climate shift would have eroded the data within a few short millennia. The cosmic crosshairs would have degraded, the stellar alignment would have been lost to the rain. They engineered a solution that borders on modern forensic science. By sealing the entire complex in a tight, densely packed matrix of refuse and soil, they stripped the environment of oxygen. They created a perfectly protected anaerobic environment. In doing so, they halted the chemical weathering of the limestone. They stopped the biological decay of the organic materials left inside. They pressed pause on the brutal laws of thermodynamics. This airtight tomb perfectly preserved the geometric layout and the terrifying astronomical carvings for 12 millennia. Analyze the audacity of that time horizon. Modern concrete degrades in a single century. Steel structures rust into absolute oblivion. Our pristine digital data centers will be wiped clean by a single robust solar flare. Yet, these ancient architects successfully engineered a physical data storage drive that survived 120 centuries of planetary chaos. We are so incredibly arrogant
assuming that we are the first generation to think in deep time. We build seed vaults in the Arctic and bury nuclear waste in glass cylinders, patting ourselves on the back for our foresight. The geophysicist looking at the radar screen sees the exact same impulse, executed 12,000 years ago. They knew the world was unstable. They knew the comet had changed everything. They realized their physical bodies would not survive the long winter.
But ideas are bulletproof, provided you build the right kind of armor. They transformed the entire hill of Gobekli Tepe into a geological message in a bottle. They cast it into the ocean of time, calculating that, eventually, a future iteration of humanity would possess the technological optics required to unearth it, scan it, and read the code. They were not building a grave. They were building an intellectual bridge over the abyss of human amnesia. Standing on the dusty surface of the Urfa Plateau, the geophysicist feels the crushing weight of that ancient intention. Beneath their boots lies a suspended animation chamber holding the genesis code of human cognition. Every step over the unexcavated dirt is a step over the buried intellect of a master species. The heat radiating from the ground is absolutely nothing compared to the intellectual friction of knowing exactly what sleeps beneath the soil. The final day of this monumental operation was a masterclass in logistical sacrifice. Thousands of workers, the very people who had engineered mutant wheat to feed the builders, are now dumping the final baskets of earth over the apex of the highest pillars. The sun sets, casting long shadows not over a sprawling stone city, but over an artificial, silent hill. The great lens pointing to the star Sirius goes dark. The cosmic machine is officially powered down. They walked away from the epicenter of human achievement, dispersing back into the wild, carrying the genetic code of domesticated wheat with them. They willingly traded their centralized, megalithic power for a decentralized, nomadic survival strategy. They traded the glory of the monument for the security of the vault. This counterintuitive decision is the ultimate proof of their genius. They prioritized the permanent survival of the data over the temporary vanity of the display. You were programmed to believe that human progress is a relentless march forward, a continuous accumulation of structures and cities. Gobekli Tepe proves that true intelligence sometimes requires hitting the abort button. It requires the profound wisdom to recognize when a civilization has reached its peak utility, and the discipline to bury the evidence before it is destroyed by the elements. They won the evolutionary game, and then they deliberately flipped the board. As the radar sled continues its slow sweep across the buried horizon, the ultimate realization takes hold. The hardware was securely entombed, completely safe from the ravages of the Ice Age and the erosion of deep time. But the software, the abstract mathematical thought, the agricultural technology, the capacity for complex social organization, was already released into the wild. The monument was buried in the dark, but the virus of civilization had already infected the human species. The virus of civilization did not simply survive, it mutated and conquered the globe. While the great stone pillars slept in perfect darkness under the Urfa Plateau, the biological chain reaction they ignited began to rewrite the surface of the earth. We watch the empires of Sumer, Egypt, and Rome rise in a hyperlapse of human ambition, totally oblivious to the fact that their grand achievements are merely echoes. The true foundation of the modern mind was already buried 12,000 years ago. Your textbooks sold you a comfortable myth. They taught you that human progress is a series of independent miracles,
that agriculture and architecture spontaneously generated in isolated pockets of the ancient world. This is a statistical impossibility. What you are witnessing is the invisible legacy of a single, highly localized cognitive explosion. Once a mind grasps the abstract geometry of the cosmos and the genetic manipulation of nature, that code cannot be erased. You cannot uninvent an idea. Let me shatter another misconception about human isolation. Ideas travel faster than empires. Millennia after the deliberate entombment of this site, the exact same distinctive architectural motifs, the massive monolithic T-shaped pillars, suddenly erupt from the bedrock in the isolated islands of Malta. They form the core of the earliest megalithic temples scattered across the Mediterranean. This is not parallel thinking. This is a direct download from an ancient, decentralized network of builders. But the architecture was merely the casing for their most dangerous technology. The genetic modification of einkorn wheat, achieved in the shadow of those very pillars, acted as a biological terraforming engine. By creating a reliable, storable surplus of calories, they allowed localized human populations to absolutely explode. This is the brutal math of history. That single botanical hack triggered a demographic shockwave that directly laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. You look at the skylines of New York, Tokyo, and London, and you believe you are seeing the pinnacle of independent modern engineering. But you are suffering from a chronic case of historical amnesia. Every skyscraper, every massive logistical supply chain, every organized labor force required to build the contemporary world is simply a variation on a theme. The hardware has been upgraded from limestone and flint to glass and steel, but the underlying algorithm remains entirely unchanged. The terrifying, brilliant truth is that we have not invented anything fundamentally new since the Ice Age. We are currently running the exact same socio-economic operating system that was originally coded on that windswept hill 12,000 years ago. The builders did not just carve constellations into rock. They programmed the behavioral matrix of the entire human species. They forced us to look up, to organize, to dominate. And we have been executing their master plan ever since. The screen of history goes dark, and the dust of the Urfa plateau settles. But the master plan is far from finished. Look up. The same stars that burned above the limestone pillars 12,000 years ago are now being tracked by orbital telescopes and mapped by artificial intelligence. We spent a century digging in the dirt, desperate to find our origins, only to realize the builders were never pointing down. They were pointing us exactly where we are heading, right now. Your entire education was based on a biological fallacy. You were told that survival is the ultimate human driver, that we simply stumbled into civilization because our stomachs were full. The geometry carved into this Turkish hillside shatters that illusion permanently. Vision precedes survival. We did not build a cosmic observatory because we had harvested enough wheat. We violently mutated the genome of nature itself solely to fuel our obsession with the stars. The human brain is not merely a survival mechanism. It is a singularity engine. Long before we possessed silicon processors, deep learning algorithms, or the mathematics of quantum mechanics, we held the raw capacity for profound abstraction. The nomads of the Ice Age were running the exact same cognitive software you use today. They calculated an invisible geometric grid across hundreds of feet of rough terrain simply because the human intellect demands order from chaos. We are now approaching the final symmetry of their vision. If a handful of nomadic tribes could bend the trajectory of the planet to map the heavens, the potential we hold in an era of interplanetary rockets and synthetic intelligence is literally boundless. But this requires you to discard the comfortable myths of the past. If this investigation shattered your old timeline, subscribe and join this frequency. We're not just decoding history here. We are reverse engineering the future.
The lesson is written in stone, preserved in the frozen earth, and waiting in the sky. You are not the descendant of frightened cavemen huddling in the dark. You are the direct heir to a lineage of visionary architects who looked at a hostile, chaotic world and decided to mathematically conquer it. The ancient blueprint is yours now. It is time to start building again. Class dismissed.